So, thank you for coming back. This week is kind of a fun one, I think, because we get to talk. In some ways, the things we're talking about today are not entirely new, right? We've discussed a couple of times the ideas of natural mapping and physical demand. In fact, I should have asked that question. This week is really about physical demand, right? It's about that requirement. Well, what was it to say physical demand in video games? That was something we talked about in week 1. What does that mean to say physical demand?
The requirement of your ability to control the controls in the game.
Yeah.
In order to manipulate your character in the method that you so want them to do.
That's right. And if you remember, it kind of had like 2 dimensions. Because there was the controller itself, like your ability to actually manipulate the interface. And then there was also the exertional effort. Like you have to actually expend energy. And while those things are connected to each other, they're not one and the same, right? You could have a really complicated controller that doesn't require a ton of like physical energy. And you could also have really, really natural and uncomplicated controllers that you sweat while you're using the game, right? And we saw in our research that wasn't a planned divide. We didn't expect that when we did this research, but that came out in our data. It's several times we'd see people talk about the controller interface being natural or not. And then they would talk about the environment itself. In fact, I've got kind of a fun story. So I know Jared knows a lot about this, and Avery as well, because I talk about it a lot. And Phil, I'm really big into retro gaming. And I just recently, I got my TurboGrafx 16 in the mail. Well, what's interesting about this system, I never played this as a kid. I never actually owned one. And so this controller looks pretty standard, doesn't it? I mean, it's a rectangle, and it's got 2 buttons, and it's got the D-pad, and it looks pretty standard. But what are these guys over here? Any idea what those are?
Some type of turbo switches or player control switches.
The turbo. I like Sam's response. I don't know. Buttons don't have sliders. They're turbo switches, which was a big thing. And I actually had forgotten about them. So the TurboGrafx 16 was very popular in Japan. Had a lot of the spaceship shooter type games where you just fly from left to right or from top to bottom. And those are some of my favorite games. And I had forgotten about the turbo switch. And so I was just getting dusted playing this game. And it's because I had the turbos off. Because do you know what a turbo switch does for a game controller?
Depending on the controller and the system, it reads your inputs faster.
Yeah, and exactly. In this case, when you sometimes if you hold the button down, the system will read that as lots and lots and lots of rapid presses, right? And in older sort of button smashers, turbo is a big deal. A lot of folks thought it was cheating, actually. Like if you had a turbo controller, you were kind of cheating, because you were hitting the buttons faster than you can humanly hit the buttons. And well, anyway, it was just a good example. On the one hand, this controller is like really, really, really natural to a gamer, but I had forgotten about these switches. Or I kept forgetting to turn them off. And so I'd play other games where I definitely did not want turbo, like a menu-driven game, and I turned the game on, and I was just flying through the menus and not reading anything. I didn't know what was going on. Same thing, had the turbo buttons on. So it's just an example of something that can be both natural and not natural at the same time, right? And it took me a minute to remember, oh yeah, this controller had turbo buttons on it. And that was something that was unique at the time. I remember as a kid, that was a real big deal. Because in a way, it wasn't cheating because it was on the original controller. Whereas if you brought a third-party controller and then plugged it in, you were cheating. It wasn't cool. It wasn't fair kind of deal. And I thought that was kind of interesting. So if we think about natural mapping, we think about, physical embodiment. I think we've even used this slide in class already. And some of you have pointed out the Omnitrax actually isn't that great of a treadmill. Can anybody describe how that Omnitrax on the left actually works? So it looks like you walk around. What does it really do, though?
It keeps you in place. You run on the treadmill, and it just reads the weight that you're distributing on the treadmill
Yeah.
itself, so
And
that
you
it could be like, oh, you're walking now.
and you
I
don't so
prefer the
much
term
run.
slide mill.
Go ahead, Jared. Yeah.
I prefer the term slide mill, which I've heard tossed around for stuff like
Because you
that.
kind of
And
slide
that's
on the
how
bottom of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, it was to a lot of people. Has anybody used one by chance? I'm just curious. Yeah, and Alex, it's how would you describe it in terms of naturalness?
I felt like I was going to fall over the entire time that I was using it.
A lot of folks said this. In fact, this locomotion mapping has been really, really hard to pull off in VR. And we're seeing folks really struggle with it. Like they're not quite sure how to hop in there and glide along these experiences. The Infinideck is supposed to be much better. In fact, that's the one on the right and from Ready Player One, which we've actually been having conversations with that company, but they've kind of dried up. I think that COVID is just really making it hard to do some partnerships right now. So, fingers crossed, we still have some conversations about that particular deck. I don't know if anybody's ever used an Infinideck before, but the big difference there is it is an actual treadmill that you run around and walk around on. But these would be really good examples, I think, of the attempts at cutting edge software to get people up and moving around, and what would be the purpose of moving around and walking around for these devices? What are they trying to do for us at the end?
More immersion.
So Sam says more immersion, and I want to talk about that term in a little bit because I think he's right.
I would say kind of along with the readings, it would be about, more natural natural movements.
Because you don't have to learn something new, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's, I think, what Alex is sort of was critiquing. Like, I wasn't really walking around. I was half falling off my ass the whole time because it's a little trippy and a little weird. And they kind of keep you in a... Alex, did you have to wear is there like a harness for that system or like a belt or...
Yeah, you can see the little ring on the left one. The
Okay.
ring keeps you in place, and you also have a harness. I don't know if you
Okay.
guys can see that,
Okay.
but it's kind of like a diaper. It feels like a diaper that they just wrap around you.
Okay.
And it kind of holds you in place, because when you step somewhere, your body's going to push itself in that direction. That's how walking works.
Right.
But that harness holds you in place. So it basically halts all your momentum that you're creating every time you step.
Which is interesting, right? Because the naturalness of walking gets almost irreparably disrupted because the machine doesn't let you lean and move and, all the things that we would normally do. I don't know how many. So Dr. Jamie Banks studies robotics in our department, in our college. And she talks a lot about how the next level of locomotion in machines, where they look very smooth. Part of it's been hard to program because we don't quite know how humans do a lot of the things they do in terms of balance, because some of those behaviors are so invisible to us. They're so under the radar to us that we don't know how to explain them in order to program them. So you may have seen videos online of people hitting robots with hockey sticks trying to knock them over, and the robot will stutter a little bit. And in a way, it looks kind of goofy, but those would be examples of like truly natural movement. It's been said that it's much easier to teach a robot how to throw a baseball than throw a frisbee, or rather catch a baseball than catch a frisbee. Baseballs have a pretty clear trajectory. Frisbees don't. And we don't quite know how we make some of those tacit judgments. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Cool. Very cool. Thanks, folks. So popular culture has all sorts of these. We're going to talk about cyborgs first. And we're going to kind of go back theoretical a little bit and then boil it back down to VR. And so like pop culture has all sorts of these cyborg characters, right? And we talk about them like they're fiction. How would you describe some of the folks on screen? So they all kind of fall under the label of cyborg. Help me out.
I mean,
Who's
you
the
have the
top left
Terminator.
So the Terminator, bottom right corner, right? And the Terminator is a fully
Futuristic
robotic
murderer.
character. Go ahead.
Futuristic murderer.
Yeah,
Just
futuristic
comes into
murderer.
nowhere.
Cold, calculated. I mean, literally, remember the scene from
He
Terminator?
removes his own eye so he can see better. He's like,
Right.
I don't need this. This isn't helping me.
And
I need
you
to be better.
and when you see his view his view is literally like he's calculating things like, odds of this here, and that's the thing. It's a machine. In fact, why does the Terminator even have skin? Does anybody remember from the movie?
Wasn't it to with humans?
One's to blend in with humans. What's the other reason? There's actually a narrative reason. It's the big sort of plot hole. Only organic matter can be transported through time. And so they wrap the Terminators in organic matter.
That doesn't change the fact that it's mostly metal.
Trust me, we have had this debate in pop culture clubs for a very long time. You're like, it's fine, move on. Right?
I forgot about that.
But the point, of course, is that it's a cold, calculated machine, and of course, like Cyborg from Teen Titans Go isn't cold and calculated, right? In fact, he's kind of the goofy, fun one of the group. Although if you read the comic books, Cyborg is not a goofy, fun character. He's a pretty tragic character. And actually the image in the bottom right is his origin, where he's basically put under surgery and his dad turns him into a cyborg, and there's a big family breakout because you see, like, I hate you, old man, I hate you, I don't want to be this, and now I'm this thing. I don't know if you know who's in the top corner, but that's an MMA fighter we call Cyborg because she's really tough. I mean, she's like unbreakable. Go ahead, Phil.
Amanda. Their name Chris Cyborg?
I'm actually blanking right now. I'm actually blanking on the name. If somebody has it, let me know.
She's Brazilian.
But her, the point is that her nickname is the Cyborg because she's thought to be pretty much unbreakable. What am I getting at with these characterizations? Cyborgs are typically not very human, right? They're these sort of organic things, but we talk about them in very cold, calculated, like machinistic, technological, less than human, right? They don't have some of the traits that make them warm characters. Okay. A cybernetic organism is one that basically has organic and inorganic parts. Now, if we were to go a little further, so on this screen, we also have different cyborgs. And we have our Terminator again, where he's taken off his arm skin to reveal his, machine body. But what about the person on the left?
It's a human that's gotten a cybernetic implant.
Yeah.
Into the
Yeah, and this one in particular, she's a war veteran who was wounded. And of course, we're seeing a major advancement in cybernetic prosthetics for veterans in particular. It's where a lot of the research is being done. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sam. I was going to say Justine, but I didn't think that was right, and it's Justine O, so thank you for that. And of course, the way those prosthetic works is they interface with the biological system that we have. The nerve endings work like nerve endings, and you more or less use your cybernetic arm in the same way you would use your regular arm. But we'd probably not talk about this person in terms of being less than human, right? It's not a conversation we would typically have. In fact, I think some people might even argue the opposite. They might even argue that this person knows what it's like to lose an arm. Most of us don't. They've had a level of pain and experience that probably have taught them more about the human condition than most of us could ever possibly aspire to. We probably would not use cold, calculated robot killer to describe, the veteran mother who came back from the war missing an arm, and now she has a cybernetic arm. These often tend to be human interest stories, right? And we talk about them. And maybe you have relatives that have gone through these surgeries before, right? And we don't run away from them because of their robot arm. We might joke about it if we're close with them. But where I'm going, of course, is that when we talk about cyborgs, when we talk about this blending of the technical and the biological, from a pop culture perspective, it tends to have a very negative connotation. And in fact, in a lot of video games, cyborgs are usually trying to kill you, or you're usually trying to kill them, right? It's not something that we typically celebrate most of the time. And something that we have to establish for today's conversation is that one of the things about technology is that it more or less is humanity. And so one discussion that we've often had as we go through this notion of a technology is that we're talking about tools that we use as part of the human condition. And so Alex pointed out that there's a distinction between a cyborg and an android, and that's true. But of course, the conversation today is about the tools that we integrate into ourselves. Like literally the things that we attach to ourselves, take up on ourselves, touch them, use them. An android would be a fully autonomous, fully inorganic, separate being, which is a good conversation, don't get me wrong. What makes the cyborg conversation important for today is that where I'm going to eventually go is that that's what all of these things are. And as we start putting things on our bodies and putting things on our heads and wearing gloves and bodysuits or getting implants, like these are all efforts to be embodied in digital space, right? To interface with computer spaces or digital spaces in the same way that we interface with physical spaces. And that's where the break with Android happens, because it's a conversation about sort of meat space. So in many ways, an Android would be taking fully inorganic beings and putting them in regular space, physical space. Whereas the conversation about cyborgic technologies going digital can often spin us towards taking us and putting us in those spaces, which is going to be an important distinction as we kind of go down the road here. Has anybody seen the movie? It's on the screen right now, and I can't play it, unfortunately, because of the bandwidth.
2001, Space Odyssey.
Yeah, and does anybody know the scene that I'm referring to? And so the obelisk is like a major part of the movie. It's meant to represent higher intelligence, and it's never 100% clear, I don't think, Javier, but that's kind of the idea. Like it's a divine intervention of some kind, and we don't know. I think it comes from Jupiter eventually, but that comes later.
Yeah, the scene in particular is basically like a very early adaptation of technology, because basically like two ape tribes that are fighting,
right? And
one discovers a bone and discovers that the bone could be used, for like combat, for hitting people, and then to further emphasize it's a jump in technology. There's like a graphic edit between when the bone is thrown in the air and then it cuts to a ship in the future of similar shape. And it's a graphic edit made by the editors and director to show that they're both advancements in technology at two different time points.
Right. There's this famous scene to where the warring tribes, one of them picks up a bone, right, and he discovers for the first time that bones can be used as weapons. And if I have this bone in my hand, and all of us carry bones around, we can beat up the other apes and run them away from the watering hole. And so they do. They beat up the other apes. They kill some of them. The other ones run away. And then the apes that use bones celebrate around the watering hole. And then at one point, the one on screen right now throws his bone up in the air. And it kind of like spins around in circles a little bit. And then there's this dramatic cut to a space station. And so as Javier really well pointed out, like that is sort of this notion that these tools make us who we are. Right. So on the one hand, a space station could not be more artificial if we tried. We on this call cannot live up there. Like we can't do it. Like we're not meant to be there biologically speaking. It's freaking impossible. It doesn't work. Right. Yet, as we develop these systems and as we develop systems that we can interface with and understand, we can extend our reach and be in other places. Fascinating research, by the way. There's a general suggestion that we know more about space as a collective human knowledge than we do about the bottom of the ocean. And it's a weird thing to think about. Like, wow, like we don't know as much about the sea below us as we do the stars above us. Because it's really, really hard for us to go underwater. You think we're bad at space, we're really bad at water. We're good with Earth. That's what we're good with. Sam, go ahead.
I saw a video talking about the water and like the atmosphere doubles after 10 feet. So it's like you can only go like 300 feet until you have a very serious problem.
Yeah, essentially we just can't do it. Like we don't know how to build the technology to keep us from just being collapsed, So this is all very conceptual, and we're just talking about this basic idea of being cyborgic, but it's going to play a role for how we think about physical engagement with these digital systems, right? And again, I wish the clip rolled out because it's and remember, for everybody on the call and everybody back at home, you can download the slides, and all of these like video points and different things are interactive. You can play them on your own, and it will play this scene for you. It's about I think it's like a 3 to 4 minute scene. I think, Javier, this one's cut a little bit. All right, so two big things here. They're going to play a role. One of them is that we know that our brains are neuroplastic. In essence, they rewire with experience. We're very, very good at taking tools in our environment, or taking really any stimulus in our environment, working that into how we understand the world, and then remapping it accordingly. That's going to play a role for our ability to quickly pick up technologies. Like, Alex, I'm thinking about that Omnitrax. I suspect with enough experience, it'd be easy. Like, after you use it for a little while, you probably get used to it. You know,
you can get used to it. It's just how do I put it? It's always going to feel different. I got
definitely
used to it. I played with it for about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So I wasn't like, pick it up for 15 minutes. How did you feel? It was
right.
I played it for an hour and a half after I've already played VR in the past.
Right.
And it does not feel the same. It is a very clear distinction between how you normally walk and this system that exists that they're using to mediate between you in the real world and you in the virtual world.
And I think you're right. And I think, in fact, lots of systems are probably like that. If you think about all the systems we use on a daily basis, some of them make a lot of sense. And some of them might make sense, but have no reason to make sense, except that we just used it a lot. And here in a couple slides, I'm going to give some really concrete examples. But what you're discussing is kind of an example of neuroplasticity. We eventually learn the relationships over time, and then we figure it out. You know, we can use all sorts of different tools. We can do this with and it's one of the reasons why we're good at using tools, period. Tools, by their definition, are not natural, right? They are inorganic, external technologies that we co-opt as a way to engage some experience at some deeper level, right? It just doesn't work that way. But the reason tools work, and the reason that humans are really good at using them, is we have an ability to re-network ourselves. It's one of the reasons why I don't like research when people say things like, social media rewires your brain. And my response is, everything does. That's how our brains work. They're always rewiring. They're dynamic muscles. They're not static blocks of gray. That's how your brain works. In some of my graduate courses, we talk about a spreading activation notion, that when you hear a concept, you think of other concepts. We talk about cognitive neo-association, where you hear a concept, you think of other concepts, and then you start reassociating words with each other. That's one of the ways that we learn, right? We learn how to sort of tunnel out, this concept means this theory. When Jared was talking about his differential equations test, a big part of learning differential equations is relearning logic. You know, and this equation only makes sense under this logical set of principles. We put all those things together. And we can do that with external tools as well. And it works really well. Jared had a question in one of his things for today about his parents. He was talking about how, I get him into VR. Jared, why don't you ask that question? This is a good time for it.
Okie doke. Let me pull it back up. There it is. My parents had issues using normal game controllers, like Xbox controllers. However, after just a few minutes with practice with VR controllers, they have no issues interacting with the environments in the various ways. What's the reason behind this?
Part of it might be this, right? As they start using these things, the models start to activate and the things start to reconnect, right? Does that make sense?
Well, one of them hardly can even play video games on like an Xbox controller, or play Smash Bros with us or Mario Kart. They just basically can't. But with VR, they have little to no issue.
It probably requires a lot less rewiring. I mean, the whole point of VR in many ways is to engage your current perceptual system, right? You may not have to just learn as many skills, Whereas like this controller, I mean, I'm thinking of Alex's conversation. This thing makes no sense to a non-gamer. This is weird. It's a rectangle with buttons on it. What do you mean that's how you drive a car? I don't drive a car that way, right? But as you use it, you get used to it. So yeah, it could very well be the case that it just doesn't require as much rewiring. It requires quite a bit of rewiring to learn a completely foreign interface like a Xbox controller, but maybe a lot less rewiring to simply just nudge your already existing models of how you turn your head and move your hands just to do digital things, right? So that could be an idea. It could just be it doesn't require as much rewiring, you know? Conversely, people who, I don't know if anybody on the call was like a diehard PlayStation person or a diehard Xbox person. I tend to be a Sony person, and as a result, I have a hard time using Xbox controllers, even though they're very similar. Sam, go ahead.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, like you give me the other controller, and I'm like, I'm no good.
Player.
Yeah, it happens.
I went to one of my old classmates' house. We were playing Xbox, and I took the controller, and I think he handed me while he was flying the plane. I instantly crashed, and he was like, "Why'd you do that?" I was like, "Because I don't know what I'm doing."
It happens. I know that not to mention it's the built-in excuse, right? You're playing Madden with somebody and you're on an Xbox, and so if I lose, well, it's just because it's on an Xbox. If this was a PlayStation, I would have won, right? So one idea is that we can rewire. That's one.
I don't play those games. So.
The other one is a scaffolded mind, and a lot of the people on the call who were in my my CMI course have heard of this already. The idea of the scaffolded mind is that we're really good at outsourcing things to external devices. So there are some folks on the call who are taking notes right now. And one of the reasons, why do we take notes in classes? I mean, I know it sounds silly, but why do we do it?
It helps us to remember what happened in the class, as well as it's a thing that we can go back to if we don't remember what was said exactly.
Yeah, so one notion is that the act of transcription somewhat helps you focus, and you basically read it twice, and it can help you with storage and retrieval. But the other one I think is more critical is that it gives us a place to store things for later. We know we're not going to remember everything. We can't. We can't pay attention to everything. And so we choose information that we might struggle to remember, information that seems important, so that when we go back later, we can retrieve it. I mean, in many ways, that's no different than a computer file. It's just a notebook on your desk. I mean, when you go to your desktop and go through like your notebook and pull up a piece of paper from class that day, it's not that different than going to your computer and pulling up a file and reading it, or how a computer would do it. There's a lot of parallels, by the way, between how computer systems are designed and how humans process information, in part because we design them. So we design them in a way that makes sense to us. The scaffolded mind is this ability to outsource content and grab it later, and to basically integrate. You know, we recognize sort of as humans that there are some things we're really good at, and we'll do those things. But there are some things that technologies are better at. Keeping time is a good example of this. I mean, I think we talked about it already in a previous course. You know, if I ask what time it is, most of you will say you know, even though you don't know what time it is. Because the only way you would know that is if you're sitting there counting, and you've been counting since the beginning, or if you happen to be outside and can read the clouds. But even that's a bit of a technology, right? Or maybe you've got like a watch in your hand and you can go, oh, it's 9:38 or whatever it is. My point is you don't know. It's just that you have these technologies that can recall the information for you very quickly. You more or less do know what time it is. You know, when I think it was Sam Googled Justino to tell us who Cyborg was. Like, we don't know the answer, but we know we can get it very quickly. Many folks who are in engineering majors, this is a big debate, you know, why can't I use a calculator in class, or why is it okay to use a calculator in class? Because, of course, engineers don't walk around memorizing everything. I can promise you this. They don't, like, you don't get fired at Boeing because you don't memorize equations. They want you to know the concepts, but when you're actually building spaceships, they would rather you use a computer than do it by hand. You know, we recognize that those things can be much faster, much more efficient, and then you can spend your time doing something else, right?
And less chance for error.
Yeah, less chance for error. And that's exactly right. We recognize that it's not that Javier can't do calculations, but we need his brain to do something else. And we're going to let the calculator do the calculations. And we're fine with this. And as long as he knows enough about the content to call it out when it's broken, we're going to be okay, right? So we definitely have these. And these two concepts seem pretty simple, but they play a really big role in how we think about technology and how we think about how it integrates in our daily lives. And so this slide we actually saw in a previous class. The idea of the natural-born cyborg, or the cyborg's dilemma. And I think when it was brought up, I said, let's wait a little bit. Does anybody remember what the cyborg's dilemma was, or what it is? It still is a dilemma. It's a philosophical dilemma, of course. It's not a real dilemma in the sense that we don't have a crisis over this. So what is the cyborg's dilemma?
Isn't it at one point? It is. What point are you no longer human? As you keep changing.
So that's the underlying question, right? At what point are we no longer purely human, or at what point are we completely cyborgic? It's a deeply philosophical question. That the purpose is less about trying to answer the question, but more about thinking about its implications for systems design, for VR and gaming design, for physical inputs, right? What is the dilemma, Jared? So you're right. It is definitely a question about to what extent are we cyborgs or not. But what's the dilemma?
Well, I'm not going to cut in on Jared.
Go ahead. I think he's passed the torch.
Okay. In my head, I thought of it as it kind of could become a morally gray area to keep. Like if we got the point where we could make cyborg enhancements to ourselves, it kind of does hit that moral gray area of, is this okay?
It's not really a moral debate, though.
It is also, there's the psychological, are you still human?
Yeah, I mean, there are other people who debate it morally, but I don't know if the reading from Bioka was a moral debate. In fact, the thing you just said about, when we start, you talked about it as if we're not cyborgs yet. What do you think Bioka would say about that?
Fair point. Point taken.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think? Half the folks on this call have headsets and gloves and walk around in digital spaces through completely mediated means and do so in a pretty natural way. Almost all of us. I say this from completely no experience in VR. I have no experience in VR at all. So I'm saying that from a completely blank perspective when it comes to VR. Well, I'm even going to say using these things or carrying on a tablet or having a wristwatch on. The dilemma is that technologies are inherently inorganic. They're inherently unnatural. We're not born with them. We don't need them to survive, from a physiological perspective, right? They're totally unnatural. However, as we start to use them and integrate them into who we are, they become more natural. They become increasingly integrated into that, those mental networks that we have, that scaffolded mind that we have, to the point where we almost can't imagine not having them. I mean, I think about, living in West Texas, you pretty much have to have a car. It'd be really hard to live here. I mean, I have friends who don't have cars who live here. It's hard for them. The time means something very different if you're relying on the bus. You go into the store is very different. There's lots of things that are very different. The argument behind the cyborg's dilemma is as we use these technologies, they become increasingly natural. But as they become increasingly natural, you could argue that we become increasingly unnatural. And that's the dilemma he brings up, right? The dilemma is essentially what are cyborgs, or are we all cyborgs? Or what does that mean for how we talk about naturalness and humanity? Can you really separate us from our tools? And to go to the slides above this one for a bit, these are good examples of maybe it's the case that we've always been designed to use tools. I mean, if you talk to biologists or evolutionary researchers, they'll talk about this as well. There are some species who using tools is almost in their nature, which in a way is a bit of a paradox, right? Because tools are not natural. And in fact, we can all use different objective tools for different goals. The chimpanzees hitting each other with bones, that wasn't required. There's nothing that says a bone has to be a weapon, but it's a really good weapon, right? You could do lots of things with a bone. And of course, the thing you choose to do with it affects where you grow and who you are. And of course, in the point of that movie, and I think Javi explained it really well, they chose to go to war with these bones, right? That's one option. And that fundamentally changes how you go. That's pretty natural. Most of us think of, weapons pretty naturally, but they're not natural. Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The basic idea.
More natural they become to us, the more unnatural we become.
Right. And then, of course, that's the paradox, because is it really fair to say we're unnatural? Because, we're doing what we're programmed to do.
Right.
And that's the paradox. That's the dilemma. And I think he brought it up at a time where technology development was kind of coming from this perspective that cyborgs are bad. That, like Sam brought up, it's a moral debate. And I think he was trying to say, well, you could say that, but is it? Because, we've been using technology for, our entire human history. We've been using technology. How do you think we got to where we are today? And you can trace back all the different technological innovations over the last millennia that got us on this Zoom call so we don't all catch a, virus, right? That's a lot of progression. 5,000 BC, we just all have COVID. That would be it.
We are dead.
It'd be dinosaur COVID or whatever that is, right? So, lots of things change. And then, of course, the world changes around us and we can go and go and go. But I like the conversation because it talks about, it introduces the notion that this line between cyborg and not might be a bit artificial, which in itself is an irony, right? This line that is meant to define artificiality may be functionally artificial because you can't find a human who's not a cyborg. If you wanted to define it in terms of binary and digits and wires and tech, you can, but that's just a privileging of the present, The printing press is also a technology. We can go down that road as well. It also helps understand why we're designing the systems that we're designing. Because on one school of thought is you design systems that take advantage of the human perceptual system. But one argument could be, why are we replicating what we do? Couldn't we do more? Aren't there things that happen in the world that we can't sense? Can you give any examples? Anybody think of bits of information or code or, aspects of reality that humans currently are limited in their ability to perceive them?
Basically, we're going down what's that film? Lucy route, where she expands her brain and is able to see code and change code with her bare hands.
Well, let's think of things even more basic than that. Let's think of things even more basic than that.
Well, there's ultraviolet rays that we can't see, and then there's cameras that can see those lights or
infrared.
Yeah, so there's one great example. I'm going to bring it over on the screen right now. Let me know if you're able to see
an infrared.
Are you able to? Hopefully it's loading right now. Are you seeing this image? It's a guy. This is a real image. This is Neil Harbison, who is often considered the world's first cyborg. And again, we could debate what first means. And in this case, he has a robotic appendage, an artificial appendage hardwired into his brain that allows him to see color. Because he's colorblind. And basically, colors emit different wavelengths. and his sensor can pick up those wavelengths and translate those into, the impulses necessary for him to essentially see color. And not only can he see color with this essentially wand, I think Alex said it, he can actually see ultraviolet light. He can pick up colors that we can't see because our eyes can't pick up those wavelengths, but his device can pick up the sound those wavelengths activate, which allows him to process that information in ways that we can't.
So, like, let's say in regards to, let's say, hearing, because I guess an enhancement to some, if they can't hear, would be a hearing aid.
Sure.
But maybe enhancing besides that, maybe would enable a hearing aid would enable them to hear wavelengths that a human ear can't normally hear, like like a dog.
Dog whistles. Yeah, like being able to do this. My glasses, I see at 2010. Human vision's 20/20, right? That's the average. People can see at 20 feet. But with my glasses, I can see what, I see at 20 feet when most people see at 10 feet. I can see further, right? That's an enhancement. That's not just, you're on par. That's an enhancement. Many of your relatives may have hearing aids that allow them to hear far away. My mom, she has a hearing aid, and she can hear conversations like around the room. Like, it's hard to whisper around my mom because she will hear you. Or she can also just turn it off when she doesn't want to hear. And she does that sometimes. Hope she's not listening to this call. And she'll just you'll be talking like click, So we already see evidence of devices that allow us to augment ourselves in ways that go beyond our reality, beyond our human senses. Remember, we can only sense the world through those 5 senses, right? But those 5 senses, of course, are limited. So some people in systems design are like, why are we limiting ourselves to 5 senses? Why don't we go further? Or why don't we go into more detail with the senses that we have? And we do see some evidence of that. A lot of these cyborgic limbs allow people to do more, whether it's like super strength or tassel information or smelling this,
There was a guy, this is off of the cyborg enhancements. He got his arm bit off by a shark, and he has 8 different arm implements.
Oh, different tools, basically, different arm modules.
One of them is a hand that he can open and close, but the hand doesn't know when there's something in the way. So he shook someone's hand, and he showed that the hand just keeps slowly closing
on him.
So very quickly, the other person kind of fell to their knees because they were like, I can't feel my hand anymore. And then he let go, and it was just I just proved that I basically have human super strength just in my hand.
This one device, yeah. We absolutely are seeing a range, and of course, for those of us who play games and consume pop culture, none of this is all that speculative because we've already speculated on it. I mean, this is Iron Man, right? But what's on screen here is kind of a history of, and to kind of wrap up the important point of Bioka is, and I think Alex said this in the very beginning of the conversation, we're talking about sort of, and Sam as well, immersion. And immersion refers to your senses. And how can we take the natural human perceptual system and intercept it and give it more information? And of course, you see on here sensory engagement, motor engagement, and sensory motor coordination. Alex, I think your big beef with the Omnitrix was the sensory motor coordination, right? Yeah, it used the legs, but it didn't feel, they didn't line up in the way that walking normally feels. Those two things did not match each other. The coordination was way off. This is one of the harder parts of systems design in VR right now, is trying to coordinate what you're receiving as a human to what you have to do as a human. And those two things happen to be very far off. Anybody ever had VR sickness before? Or just get dizzy? That's where it comes from. The information's just not syncing up right now. We're still working on that one. There's a lot to process.
Seen videos on people getting it.
Yeah, and it's there's a lot of it's not an uncommon thing by any means. Okay, so what's on screen now are some early examples of what we might call immersive technologies. Again, the word immersion for our class is referring to an objective property of the technology. It's a feature of the technology that basically envelopes a sense, or the sense is. Okay, so the sensorama, aptly named. Oh, I think that's 40s, where you just like stick your head in this box, which would close out all light. You could only see what's on screen. I believe the Sensorama also had like flavor injectors for smell. You could hear things because they'd be broadcast in stereo. This is an early example of VR, you know, of trying to simulate your senses to make you feel like you're somewhere else, right? We talked about presence already, right? This person with their head in this machine is being made to feel like they are somewhere else. And that's a really critical thing to think about, okay? Over here, you've got one of the earliest AR devices. It was called the Sword of Damocles. Has anybody seen this before? It was developed at MIT, and all it did was generate boxes in your field of vision, like wireframe boxes. But it did this in the 60s. And you could look around, and the device would put digital objects in your normal field of vision. It was never mass produced. There was only one. And of course, one of the reasons why is it was remarkably heavy. That's why it's suspended from the ceiling. And if you know the story, the Sword of Damocles, you'll get the reference. But it's still on display at MIT. They have a technology lab where they have all of their early devices. This is one of them. Then you had some interactive video technologies in the 70s and 80s where you could... Has anybody ever done this at a museum where you go in front of a projector screen and you move around and like you hit the ball? And they're really low-level examples of immersion, right? Oftentimes it doesn't really show you. It'll be a shadow effect, but you can still interact with it, you know. I remember the Science Museum in St. Louis had one of these where there were like flies moving or mosquitoes moving around. You could swat the mosquitoes. Okay, and it was an exhibit on, I think, mosquito and bloodborne diseases or something like this. And then you start getting into the early development of the immersive VR systems that we kind of use today. This one, I believe, comes out of Stanford, the VPL. No, VPL was a company formed out of Atari by the early creators of VR, where we started seeing like stereoscopic, you know, headsets and gloves, and of course the folks in the Call Out VR experience recognize the tracking devices, so the device can see how you're moving around and measuring light movement and things of that nature. Okay. Getting into modern stuff, we've got technologies. Has anybody ever seen a heat map? Mm-hmm. These are eye tracking devices, and we actually have these in the College of Comm. We've got VR headsets that can do eye tracking, where we can actually find out sort of where you're looking when you read things. This is how most people read a Google search when they get the search results. And a lot of web design is taught. They talk about this golden triangle, and so in web design, for whatever reason, humans naturally will read the top right. And actually, can you guess why we might do that? Start in the top right corner. I'm going to argue it has nothing to do with the actual Google search at all. Any reason why we might start at the top right corner and work our way down?
We worried from... Wait, isn't that the top left?
Or top left, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I thought that was
The
because
results. That's what you're worried about.
So I'm going to argue that it has nothing to do with Google's algorithm, because in fact, Google takes advantage of this to give you crappy results at the top. And we'll talk about that in a moment.
Oh,
It's just how you read.
That's how people in Western cultures especially read,
left to
right? This is how we're used to reading a page. We call it a web page, and we probably read it the same way. What's curious about what Alex just said is he's right. Like when we get Google results, we get them on the top. But when you do a Google search, what do you get at that very top left corner?
At times you get ads.
Yeah, a lot of times it's a sponsored search returns. They always give you 2. You ever wonder why it's only 2? Well, this is why. Because they know that when that page pops up, you're going to look up there right away. They can sell that space. And then you're going to look at the rest of the ads. It's prime real estate. And we know this because it's not, it's almost a natural, intuitive way that at least, you know, in English speaking or Western nations, we read the internet. It's both totally natural and completely unnatural. But it happens with so much regularity that I could design my system knowing that you're going to interface with it just like this. And this golden triangle has been shown over and over and over and over again. And anybody who's taken a web design class may have already learned about this. You know, they talk about how you design an interface. This is classic user experience research. You know, over here we've got the new Oculus systems that allow you to just use your hands and you don't have to have the controllers anymore. Well, how have they done that? Well, the systems have gotten really good at knowing how a human hand tends to be shaped, where the inflection points are, and it can map, you know, your knuckle movements, and it can sort of estimate the wireframe that would underlie your hand when it's doing these different things. That's pretty wild. That's a very natural system, except our hands aren't shaped like that, but that shape is close enough for us to make a fist, and then it makes a fist in the system. Now, are they perfect? No, they're not perfect. Are they getting better? Does anybody have a Quest on the phone call?
My little brother has a Quest.
Have you done the hand actions yet?
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, like it's surprisingly accurate. I mean, for a $300 headset, like that's pretty good. And with the Quest, yeah, you just put your hands up, and the headset immediately knows where your fingers are.
I think I can actually throw another one of my questions in.
Sure,
here.
please do.
And it's, does immersion/presence play a role in the reception of a control type?
When you say reception, what do you mean? Can you clarify that term?
I was more thinking, when I wrote that, I was reading on the themes of, I think, the first paper.
Okay.
And, you know, some people, you know, didn't really like the Wii remotes, and some people
audience reception,
like all those motion controls. However, there's not really that complaint when it comes to VR, and I think what does, you know, being immersed in it, like having a headset and being able to see something closer, does that kind of get rid of that issue?
I don't know if it's so much about the headset part, although that could be a thing.
But that was like an example.
Yeah, my suspicion is it's more about the fact that, kind of going back to the neuroplasticity, that you're using an existing model, so you're not necessarily having to relearn anything, right? There's the barrier to entry might be a lot lower. That could be one. And the other one could be that your comparison's different. So when most of us played a Wii, what were we comparing it to?
Live movement.
TV remote, as well as your own just hands, I guess.
Yeah, human movement.
Probably the GameCube controller.
So it could be both. And from the human hands one, it was terribly mapped. Not even close. Right? Like, if your comparison was reality, it was way off. It's not even close. And we talked about it on a call a couple weeks ago where we were like, you have to do very different things in here, right? You can't engage it the same way. You almost have to learn an entire new way of playing the game. And then from a gaming perspective, it's also a bad comparison because we're better at doing this than we are at doing this. And so where the Wii may have fallen is in this really weird interstitial to where it wasn't a game and it wasn't real either, which may have led to a lot of frustration. It doesn't mean the Wii didn't do well and there weren't good games, but there is a bit of irony that some of the best Wii games were actually games you played with a controller, or they were like very fun short burst games, like Wii Sports, right? Where they weren't trying to be serious. Like, there was no inclination this was really baseball. This was just meant to be something fun for a couple of minutes, right? So I suspect the reception bit there, Jared, has somewhat to do with our ability to relearn and remap the information and not having to. Somewhat because the comparison point was very different. You know, we seem to be much more forgiving about VR than we are about games. Maybe we just recognize that VR is newer and it's still a bit of a novelty, perhaps. We don't like the fact that a system can let us shoot lasers out of our fingers is still pretty cool, right? And we're not overly critical of this. But if I've been playing games for 20 or 30 years and you give me a new game controller and the controller makes me worse at the game, right? I'm like, what the heck's the point of this thing? So I think it's a good question. I think it's a really good question. I suspect that might be something to do with it. These, and as you see on screen right now, as our tech side gets better, there's less and less of a break between our expectations. Like, most of us don't expect our technologies to map our hands or to track our eyes, or like the Infinideck to let us walk in whatever direction we want to. Or the one in the corner here is the Google Glass, where I'm driving around and I have a heads-up display for life. And I can walk around and see things and do things. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to it again as we go through. This is another one, Jared, that actually might help quite a bit. So on the left, you've got like an infant using an iPad. How is that possible?
You just give the iPad to the infant, and it basically kind of learns it can learn itself. Not maybe as fast a progression as, you know, a more grown adult, but it basically kind of just basically the best way that it learns it is just by using it and spending time with it.
Well, and when we say use it, right, it's just vision and touch and some sounds, right? Like, it takes advantage of that perceptual system. The device is totally artificial. It's a rectangle that lights up, right? But the way that we engage it doesn't require a whole lot of learning.
Right.
To where, like, even like somebody with like no worldly experience could probably figure out some basic stuff here. Now, does the infant know what it's doing? Probably not. But it could, and there are some early level programs for like toddlers, for example, that are pretty simple. You know, whether it's like popping balloons or whatever, right? Any idea what's on the right there? I'm just curious if you recognize that image or know where it might be from.
Yeah, can't say.
No? So this is in Mino, North Dakota, or Minot, North Dakota. I never know how to pronounce it. It's a U.S. Air Force installation. Any help out a little bit?
It looks like it's a coordinated activation of something.
It is definitely a coordinated activation system, which means that two people have to engage it at the exact same time. What do you think we put coordinated activation systems on?
To get access to something classified or important or something.
And what do you think is in this one? I'm just curious. This is a nuclear missile silo. Yeah. This is, if those two guys turn that key at the same time, they're launching an intercontinental ballistic missile that has a warhead.
Fun.
That has a warhead on it. And they're paid to spend all day there. That's it. Their job is to go to North Dakota and work X number of years and be ready to pull that switch at a moment's notice. Why two people?
Because one person, it could make a mistake, but it takes more to get two people to do something like fire a missile like this than just one.
Well, just to be clear, like, it's that we want that. Like, we don't want this to be easy. This should be hard. We want to make sure that, like, somebody doesn't trip and spill coffee on the nuclear missile switch and then things go bad, right?
Whoops.
Exactly. What's on screen is the difference between a transparent technology, which is one that is so well integrated that we don't even think about it when we use it. It's just second nature. It's that dilemma bit, right? And an opaque technology that is intentionally obvious. The goal isn't necessarily to always make technologies transparent. I mean, there are some times where we want opaque technologies. We want you to pay attention to what you're doing. Even in interface design, there are times where we do not want you to casually do things. There's a reason that, like, some cockpits, for example, they're not simplified because I don't want to be simplified. I want you to pay attention when you're landing the airplane. And you want to be able to do these things and these things with these switches. You know, other things can be more automated. This is going to play an important role when we think about VR. And going back to Jared's question earlier, I suspect that some of this might be that many of our VR systems, especially for commercial use, we probably want them to be transparent. Right? We want them to be like, hey, yeah, hop in there, have fun, use this thing. Go have fun, go do your thing, right?
Yeah.
That's
kind of like that's what I feel like the goal of like the ISO system is, like in regards to my experience using it and using like Android, that I feel like Apple's more particular goal with ISO is to make it, you know, capable, but also make it simple for someone to use, in how it's integrated into how it's built.
One of Apple's sort of organizing, operating, I think, what's the word I'm looking for? I'll say philosophy, I'm not sure it's right, has always been to simplify the computer. You know, if you're an Apple user, you don't really see the guts of what's going on in there.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, you can't really do that much to change those parameters. The system doesn't allow you to. It's closed.
Nope.
Right? Nope. Which is why, like, you know, if you're wanting a very smooth system that doesn't have a lot of bugs and errors, you tend to go Apple because those have all been smoothed out. That's why, you know, that's why they're expensive, for one, among other reasons. Whereas there are other operating systems, like Linux is free, but you have to program everything, right? Windows is kind of in the middle. It's not free, but it's also highly customizable. I run DOS games on my computer at home, but that required a relatively extensive amount of modding to get my computer to run DOS-based video games from the early 90s, because you had to sort of trick the computer into thinking it's something else, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think you're right. Apple will be a great example, and their operating system will be a great example of very transparent. When you got your Apple earbuds, what did you have to do to set them up? Anybody have a pair?
Open the case.
Open the case.
And it was like, oh, there's headphones.
Yep. It's pretty wild, right? You get it. You're like, hey, I smell earbuds. Are those your earbuds? Do you want me to connect to your Apple right now? You know, I walk into an airport and my tablet's like, hey, you want to get online? I'll help you out with that. Don't worry about it. It's fine. You go get a coffee. Right?
You are already connected.
Yeah, whereas my laptop's like, you want to get online? I don't know. This is a new area. I don't know these people. What's the password? What are you going to do for me? And you like have an argument with your computer, right? So, yeah, very different operations here. And of course, on this one, we're probably thinking about transparent bits. So, something that Alex was talking about earlier, and I think Jared as well, and other people, is this notion of like, how do we learn these interfaces? Because like this interface is not natural. Almost everybody at the computer right now probably has this QWERTY interface. And we've been using it as computer users for a long time. Why was it designed this way? Why QWERTY? Like, that's weird.
That's how the typewriters were set up, I believe.
That is true. That is actually how the old typewriters were designed. Why QWERTY of all things?
Because it separated keys that get used a lot so that it wouldn't jam the typewriter.
Right.
Because it was a mechanical.
Exactly. The old typewriters were mechanical driven with arms. And if you typed too fast, the arms would hit each other and they would break. And once you've broken it, I mean, you can't use your typewriter, or you just can't use that letter, and eventually you'd break all of your letters. And so the typewriter was designed to slow you down intentionally so that you wouldn't break the machine, which is the opposite of how we think about typing and communication, right? It was to protect the technology, not to necessarily improve the communication, right? Going a little further here, there is actually another keyboard called the Dvorak keyboard. And you can see its layout over here. If you take a look quickly at where the letters are. And you can see the home row is very different. The fingers on the home row. For those of you who learned typing in school. And you can notice that diagram over on the left side. What that diagram is a visual depiction of sort of like your finger length to how much work each finger does on the Dvorak keyboard on the left and on the standard QWERTY keyboard on the right. And if you were to look at the standard keyboard fingers and look at your hands, they're not shaped that way. Right? Like, they're not, that's a weird, like, lobster, dolphin fin shaped hand.
There's no pinky on the left hand.
And there's no pinky. And if you think about when you type, you almost never use your pinky.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you almost never use your pinky. Now, the Dvorak keyboard hasn't really taken off. Why not?
Because
QWERTY is standard.
And when we say QWERTY is standard, let's go down that rabbit hole a little more. Is QWERTY inefficient for us as users?
No.
Not really. Like, we've gotten good at using it. Like, we've gotten really good at using it. It's not at all natural. It's not mapped for our perceptual system. But over the last 100, 120 years, we've been typing with this keyboard so much that we've gotten good at it. And that's a great example of that, like, cyborg's dilemma, right? That unnaturalness. If I were to go to your offices and hand you a Dvorak keyboard, you would go insane. Or if anybody's ever, I know people on the call, some of us speak more than one language. The German keyboard is QWERTZ, not QWERTY. And it makes me rage when I'm in Germany and I'm working at my desk and I'm typing because there's just a couple of letters are moved. And I have to, like, rewrite sentences because the Z and the Y or the Z and the Y are different, you know. And maybe other folks on the call have had that experience where, yes, QWERTY is used in other languages, and then sometimes QWERTY is not really compatible with the other language. You know, you may have less characters, you may have more characters, and you have to create symbols. All of my friends who have accent marks in their names just get whitewashed in a lot of English literature because, like, I'm not typing that name because I don't know where it is on my keyboard, right?
Right.
This is go ahead, please, yeah.
I could, like, you know, basically you build a mental model for. That's the whole point of, like, the typing when you're learning to type.
Right.
When you start out, like when I was tiny, you know, I used one finger, look for the letter, push it, look for the next one, do it. And then the whole point of the typing, you know, learning to type is basically developing a model that comes so naturally to you that you can go faster. Another example could be in regards to an actual game controller is recently, are you aware of, like, the Super Mario 3D All-Stars thing that came out? Like, pretty classic Nintendo games. Yeah, one of those is Super Mario Sunshine, which is a childhood game that I played so much and that I have, like, I know what each button does still, and very much used to it. However, for this recent, you know, one they released for the Nintendo Switch, a couple buttons changed. So the mental model is not exactly the same. So I have to put in kind of a new mental model in from the old one.
Like this controller he's talking about, that's not a GameCube controller.
Right.
Right? And those buttons might be just far enough off that it causes problems. Now, of course, you can buy a GameCube controller for the Switch, right?
Right.
But if you don't have one, you're now using this controller when you used to use this one.
Right.
And immediately you can see the differences.
Changes, like, because we bought a GameCube controller just for regards to this, but even a couple buttons changed on that.
Interesting.
Yeah. Not too much. Like, it basically like one or two buttons changed, but either way, you got to change. Like, okay, this button does this now, and this button does this now. I got to implement that into a mental model.
It's a great example. And did anybody on this call take a typing class?
Mm-hmm.
Describe what that was like. Like, how do you learn to type?
You work with a few letters at a time, you know.
And you drill, right? You type over and over and over again. Did your classes have the keyboard where it was hidden under a board so you couldn't see your fingers?
Yeah, they did that at times.
Yeah, where they come in and they actually cover your hands to where you're not allowed to look at your keyboard. And then, were you ever timed?
Oh, yeah. Well, you got to hit like the 20 words per minute. and like, yeah, you have to complete it fast enough.
Yeah. And of course, it was just drilling, because the one way you learn a skill or develop a model or rewire those networks is through drilling. And you do it enough times, and finally you have something that, as Alex kind of got at, it's not natural, but it is standard, and we've all gotten really good at it. Right? We learned how to overcome that this keyboard is supposed to make you type slow. And yet many people can type very quickly on it. You know, I think one time I had done a words per minute test. I think it was like 160. It was really fast. But I've also been writing my entire life. Like, you get to a point when, you know, you're writing papers for a living. And I was a journalist before I did this. Right? That's all you do. Eventually you get good at this, right? And that's just a matter of mental modeling. And that's going to come back to that idea of systems design, where, you know, one of the reasons we have to be careful about systems is that, you know, as Jared was mentioning with the Wii, it may not be that the system was broken. It just wasn't made for those people, right? We can see the evolution with game controllers. I mean, this is how many of our controllers you hold in your hand, going all the way back to the beginning. You know, we oddly abandoned joysticks pretty early on and went towards these digital devices. And so it's not totally surprising that for gamers and for most of our digital experiences, it's this golden hands. It's this controller. And the golden hands rule is a metaphor often used in game design. That when you're designing a game and you want to make a big, like a hit-selling AAA game, it's got to be for a controller. You know, which sounds weird with all the technologies that we have today, but the idea is like that's where the majority of people are at. I think if I were to use Alex's language, that's kind of the standard. It's a controller, you know.
I've got a question I can maybe introduce.
Please, yeah.
So one of them was basically, could the type of controller you use and like the natural mapping and it feeling natural, could the natural feeling you get depend on the game you play? For example, like I find it more natural to use a joystick for a flight simulator, but not for like other games like first-person shooters or, you know, role-playing games. Like, could it change depending on the game? Like, is the game contributing to the natural feeling?
What do you guys think? Does the target behavior matter? What does everybody think?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Basically, what I'm thinking, like, could natural mapping / the natural feeling you get depend on the game you play? And it could be maybe from like a history, like you've had more experience. Like, for example, you know, like I find it more natural to play a flight sim with a joystick and similar flight controls, but I wouldn't feel the same about playing, let's say, a first-person shooter. Like, if it was a first-person shooter, I'm like, I want a normal game controller. If it's like a flight sim, I want, you know.
So, from at least, okay, I don't want to. I'm a pretty experienced gamer. So, in my experience, the controller that you are most used to will always be the one that you try to make work the best. Some control schemes just don't work. Like, it's if people here have played Grand Theft Auto 5 on their computer, they know that flying on a keyboard and mouse is really difficult in that game. And conversely, flying with a joystick is much easier. Flying with a gamepad is much easier comparatively, even though for basically everything else, the keyboard and stuff is just generally better.
So this is a situation where it often comes down to how you're construing what you're actually doing. I mean, on the surface level, mapping is the extent to which your mental model matches the behaviors on screen in a way that is effective. You know, so there are going to be some individual differences with experience, right? You know, if I've never driven a car before and I've only played racing games in a controller, then in a very real sense, even though a steering wheel and pedals might be more objectively paired, it may not be as natural. Where it gets tricky it kind of goes off of Alex's answer there, is that naturalness is a perception. And it's one of the takeaways from today. We throw that word around as if it has objective meaning, and I don't think that it does. And that's why in a lot of more current research, we talk about perceived natural mapping instead of natural mapping.
So basically, it depends on the individual.
Well, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's so completely individualized we could never understand it, but it's probably a combination of their experience with the device, their understanding of the actions on screen, and how those things coordinate.
Okay.
Right? Like it's you could still study it objectively. You could still study lots of people. I'm going to bet that if you're in the United States and you do a driving simulator game, the majority of people are going to say that the steering wheel and the pedals are more natural than the controller. But if you were to control for video game skill, you might find a different effect. Because the gamers might go, oh, actually, no, I had no problem doing this with the controller because I've done it for so long. Right? And it speaks to what we call like a moderating or a mediating relationship where X on Y depend on something else, which is really important for system design and game design. If you're designing things for gamers, you may have to design them differently than if you're designing them for non-gamers. Or if you're designing VR for people who have done the thing, you may have to design it differently than if you're designing it for people who are brand new to the experience, right? Because they're going to bring their own models to the experience.
May I say something real quick about that? I remember reading about how the United States military was pumping out the way to control drones, and such with Xbox 360 controllers, because they knew that people that were joining the military were going to be experienced with those much more than the already complicated control systems.
That's
so
right.
Just like, well, we might as well just map it out for this.
That's a great example. In fact, and that hits, I think, dead on with what you're talking about. In fact, I used to have a great image of this. Let me see if this one pops up. You see that guy right now. This is not for a drone, but for a robot. You see him holding his controller in one hand and the robot in the other. And it's absolutely right. Of course, you have an entire generation that has been flying things and controlling things remotely with an Xbox controller. Sure, why not use that controller? Golden hands rule, right? Because what is natural? Well, it's a robot. There is no I guess the natural would be like, hey, go over there, right? But we know that this works really well. And so, yeah, Alex, there's a lot of research and development on using game controllers. And many of them are, important to his point, actual Xbox controllers. Because the feel is just there. Like, I would be terrible at this. I would need a PlayStation controller. Like, sorry, can't be drafted. I'm a PlayStation guy.
I think two of my questions kind of fit in with this controller theme.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be okay if I ask?
Yeah, please. Please do.
Okay, so my first one is it better to create a controller that feels natural from the get-go or conditioning people to think that is natural, kind of like with the PlayStation or Xbox, is like it stayed the same for so long. We think it's natural, but is it more natural?
So based on how we describe natural, how would you answer that question? Because is there such a thing as it being like when you say
natural?
That's the trick, right? The issue I think that we have here, and not that it was a bad question to ask, I think it's how we all think about these things, is that objectively natural would be referring to engaging the human perceptual system, right? But we're using totally artificial objects. I don't have a mental model for controlling an eagle that flies around, right? So, but I do have a mental model. Yeah, I'm trying to think of I think there are some superheroes that can do this. Maybe Falconers can do this.
Assassin's Creed Origins.
Yeah, but unless I'm a Falconer, I can't do this. But we do have mental models for controlling things that move and that move independent of us, which would be like the Xbox controller. So does it could we retrain everybody to use the proper drone controls? Well, what are proper drone controls? Well, they're controls that make the drone fly around and do whatever the hell a drone's supposed to do. If I can do that on a Xbox controller, Fantastic. Seems like it's going to work for us, right? It's going to cut down on training time, on research and development time. I would love to know the original engineers, because I'm going to bet they didn't suggest Xbox controller. And someone probably came in and went, what if you just used like that thing at Best Buy that all of our recruits seem to be really familiar with, and not use this like massive room in North. In fact, I have a relative who's a drone pilot. And the way the original drones were flown is they built a cockpit to simulate an airplane. And he would sit in a room with like a pilot's chair and everything that you would find in a regular like military grade airplane. And that's how they flew drones.
Mm.
Let me see if I can find it real quick.
Okay, yeah.
I used to have here it is. That's what most drone cockpits look like.
Which makes sense for the time.
Right, because these guys were pilots. Now,
So
most
they were-
pilots don't have a landline telephone in the middle, right? And those are really comfortable seats. But you can see how, for the pilots at the time, this would have made sense. But this is no more natural than dude flying Xbox. Oh, that's not the right one, right?
It just gets more complicated.
But I think you get the idea, right?
Yes.
So that's why it's that notion of naturalness gets quite tricky. Now, I suspect that those simulated drone rooms can do a heck of a lot more than your game controller can do.
Oh, yeah.
Which is kind of what Alex is getting at a little bit. Like, there's different functionalities. So it might depend on what the job is. There might be times where you do not want a transparent technology. Maybe you need the opacity of a cockpit and the screens to, like, be in the mental mindset of, I am flying combat missions in the middle of a war zone. I don't need to be doing this casually with my Xbox controller. Versus,
it looked like for the other guy with the Xbox controller, it looked like he was driving a very tiny robot that was just gonna just going for it. I was like, so it's probably just a forward and backwards key. And
purpose-driven, simple machine, one device. They're both probably useful, but it's weird. Like, which one's more natural? I don't know. And it might depend on, as Javier was saying, as Alex was saying, the user themselves, what they're experienced with. I'm going to bet that the senior pilot in the Air Force, if you hand them an Xbox controller, is going to be like, what?
Get this out of here.
This is not appropriate for flying an airplane. But the new recruit's like, sweet, this is great. I would love to fly an airplane with a controller, right? So it's a really good example, I think. I think it definitely plays a role in what we're talking about.
And then my second one again follows up on controllers. Was would it be better to make I went all along with this be better. This is not a good question scheme, but I did it. Would it be better to make a more specialized controller like I'm blanking out on the game, but it's Guitar Hero. That's it. A Guitar Hero standard game where it's very specific on the game, or just like your standard like Xbox or PS4 controller, or just things that fall along that line.
How would you answer that here with this information?
Well, I don't know, because I was just thinking about it. I was like, because when I think about Guitar Hero, I think about like you could use a standard controller to play that game.
Sure.
You just need like hold down the button and then boom.
How many folks have done that before? Use just a regular controller to play Guitar Hero. I'm actually very good with the regular controller. I score a lot better than I score on the actual Guitar Hero controller. Yeah. So
well, it just depends on the person, really.
Well, but again, just to be careful, when we say too much depends on the person, what we end up doing is basically saying it's all individual, and as a result, we can never explain it, right? I think we've got a good explanation in today's discussion about, and better is always a tough, because what does it mean to be better? I mean, are we talking about performance? Are we talking about, like, what does better mean in that case, right?
Vary, because if a person is so used to using the normal guitar system layout for a Guitar Hero, then maybe the controller won't feel as natural, and he's going to have to take more time to build a mental model to using a normal controller, and it could be vice versa.
we're also assuming that performance is the important thing here. Like, maybe I'm playing Guitar Hero because I just want to have fun with the guitar versus I'm trying to actually win the game, right? So I always push back on better questions only because I don't know there's too many answers. But I like the idea of discussing, you know, why would we use different ones for different reasons? I think maybe it was you, Alex. You had mentioned something in one of your questions about, like, in the early arcade days, the machines were designed to basically be one-to-one with their programming. So, like,
Yes.
the controllers were very customized, right?
Yes.
You'd have a driving game that would have its own driving, or a lot of times
They would have
trackball.
steering wheels.
Right.
Street Fighter had its own set of buttons with the joystick.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the NES and the Atari came along.
Yeah.
And as a result, they needed to make a standard format that every game can play in. And so what Nintendo did, specifically at least, is they said, okay, what things does every game share? And the answer was they have 4 cardinal directions, and then we'll have 2 inputs, as well as a start and a select button. Start will be to pause the game, and select will be a wild card button. And
right.
That was it.
And so it was actually on this screen right here. I think we're going to continue to answer Sam's question. Because one thing we can think about natural mapping is we can go from abstractness to concreteness. And so what Alex just talked about would be very abstract. The things you do with these buttons do not clearly relate to the things that are happening on screen, right? Abstract things are very flexible and pliable. And you can think about all the things you've done with an NES controller. And as he mentioned, to design an NES controller meant, how do we have one controller that can play 1,200 games? And we just find the things that are in common, and then the individual games do the remapping, and then the player has to learn the controls for each game. And if you have a console at home, you've done this before. You've gone through the individual systems and figured out this button does X, and this button does Y, and this button does Z, and so forth and so on, right? And as you move across this continuum, you start going to the increasingly concrete systems, right? You know, we have flight sticks here, and then like a flight stick simulator, and then our drone pilots again, and then eventually you're in a cockpit, right? And like as he pointed out, this cockpit's very concrete for flying a plane, but it probably can't do anything else as a result. If you want a fun exercise, take your guitar for like a PlayStation, and then try to play a different game with it. You technically can. It's really weird. To like use your drums to play Crash Bandicoot. You can do it. It's weird.
Oh god.
You can, but give it a shot sometime. It's a whole different experience, right?
That sounds like a new level of difficulty.
Well, and I am sure there are Let's Play videos where somebody has tried to play a game with like a rhythm controller. I would almost I would wager this. It's happened.
There are people that have beaten Dark Souls with Dance Dance Revolution.
I can see that.
Pads,
I could definitely see that. Yeah, because once you've mapped it, you're good to go, and it's kind of cool actually. Taking a concrete controller, recognizing that its underlying programming is still abstract, right? Different buttons push different options, which make things happen on screen, and then you're good to go, right? So it's not that I'm poo-pooing the idea of better, but it might really depend on what is it you're trying to explain. And I think one of the takeaways from today is that naturalness has a biological definition, and I don't think we're always talking about that when we're talking about perceived naturalness in these situations over here. And I would be curious to see the video of someone playing Overwatch with a baguette, because that's amazing.
I am very
But
curious.
somehow doesn't surprise me. I've seen folks. Isn't there a like Arduino device where you can basically take electrodes, put them into vegetables, and you can make like a vegetable-based controllers? There's a number of these different Raspberry Pi devices, especially. One of the things that Paul talked about, Paul Scalzi and his colleagues, was moving from like directional mapping to kinesic mapping, where you're actually using your body, to tangible mapping, where you're holding the device in your hand. We can kind of go back under that line and see the abstract to concreteness of these things. Okay. So that's something we've been studying a lot to figure out why people engage this stuff. There's lots of different ways to engage these digital systems, and they all have different impacts. You know, one question that didn't come up, and I'm a little surprised, is which do you think these would affect presence differently? Think about our last conversations about what presence is, and how would these affect presence? What do you think? Would a more tangible controller make you feel like you're actually there in the experience?
Maybe. It depends. Like, sense of presence it is factored in by many things. You know, like, it could,
sure.
but it could also be affected, like, if your game is glitchy, your presence is probably going to be.
But remember, these are variables, so we're never explaining all or none. It's just a matter of, like, does it contribute to the feeling?
So, from what I've seen, at least, is that in your picture example right there, the Guitar Hero controller is just a manipulation of the abstract nature of controllers.
Oh, definitely.
As we were discussing earlier. And so people saw the Guitar Hero controller, and it made them mentally click more with hitting notes in a rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, very few people played rhythm games, at least normally before then.
Right.
Guitar Hero was really the first big rhythm game that came to the West, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so afterwards, once Guitar Hero had finally broken into the West, everything like that, then a bunch of other rhythm games started becoming a really big deal.
Sure.
And so nowadays you rarely see the Guitar Hero controller, and the standard controller is now, well, the standard. But
in terms of presence, though, like, so I'm holding this guitar and I'm strumming along, and you see people playing it, and they're like leaning back and forth, and whenever they hit like the power bar, right, they whammy out. Like, is it evidence that they're experiencing more presence?
One could argue that that's because of the game that they are playing, and not because of the controller that they are using, is the thing. Because people could play Guitar Hero with a gamepad.
But remember, the question isn't yes or, like, you either experience it or don't experience it. It's about levels of experience. Of course, there could be other things that contributed. What was presence again? Let's make sure we're all on the same page with the definition. And when I say spatial presence in particular, what is that definition?
It's basically where you feel like your environment is non-mediated.
Right, where you feel as if like you're actually in the world, right? So their research showed that you do feel more presence when you have a tangible device in your hand, as opposed to not a tangible device in your hand. Doesn't mean you didn't feel any presence on the other way around, but they argued and showed that you did feel more when you were holding something. Why would the act of holding something boost presence scores?
It's more matching with what it is doing on the mediated screen. So like your let's say like your avatar and Guitar Hero is holding a guitar, now you're holding a guitar.
Right. So we're talking about being in the environment. One argument is that it completes the map, right? Literally, you're actually like, you're holding it now. Again, doesn't mean you don't feel it without it, right? And, you know, Alex is probably getting a bit more like if you're doing really well, right? There's a feedback loop there, and you're going to feel like you're in the environment because you're doing really, really well. We could talk about, you know, experience mattering or perceptions mattering. And of course, remember, we're going to talk in a couple slides about the difference between this type of natural mapping and perceived natural mapping, because that's actually where these studies got critiqued a little bit down the road. But one argument that has some data support is that if we're talking about the sense of being there, and I give you a thing and you're actually there, it completes the circuit and you feel like you're in the experience. But that assumes that the tangible controller really is more natural. And I think, Alex, is that kind of what you were getting at? Like, it may not actually be more natural for everybody.
Well, in my experience, game flow is really the thing that immerses me personally. And I know I'm talking about my personal experience.
Well, but remember, just for class, and definitions are really important.
I understand.
Yeah, when we talk about the word immersion, we really mean that, like, features of technology. The reason that's critical is that there's actually a lot of slop in the definitions as they get used outside, like, in the industry. And there's been a lot of pushback to redefine these things to make sure they're on the same page. I know Phil and I have been working. We were working with a team over at EA. I think we're still going to, and they're trying to work through some of this mess, because what happens is different researchers or different scholars will use the same word to refer to different things, and then it gets confusing in development, because I think you're using immersion in more of a metaphorical sense, right? I feel immersed in the game. Whereas from a design experience, immersion, at least from this perspective, is literally human sensory organs, right? Are they being immersed or not? But, of course, the VR people prefer that version of immersion, but the game people talk about flow, and that gets different as well. So we're going to hit that one here in a little bit. But one argument is that it completes a circuit. But I've also seen folks argue the opposite, that when you touch something, maybe you realize you're not in a mediated space. And instead you realize you're here, because it actually might break the circuit, because now it's real. Yeah, it's that one's not gotten as much consideration. You know, thinking of Alex and being on the treadmill, but having to wear like a treadmill diaper, like kind of reminds you that you're in a room strapped to a thing. You know, it's interesting. It's very interesting, but that was their original argument, was that tangible devices should increase spatial presence. And it's the argument that Javier presented, and it's that it basically lets you complete the circuit. And then what you're doing here matches what's going on there. And the data does seem to support that explanation more often than not. You know, when there's a match between the object and the action, presence tends to increase. Okay. And of course, we're talking about this already. We're seeing, you know, the natural human perceptual system. We've kind of already covered this slide. I don't know if I've ever used a power glove before. It didn't work that well, but it was a good first shot, right? I think you've seen a version of this slide in a previous conversation we've had in class. So this is the Wii discussion, right? How would you remap the controller on top to fit this action? What would you do if you were a programmer? So I think the controller on bottom is pretty easy, right? You move around and then you move your hand. And in fact, for the Wiimote, you probably wouldn't have any buttons. You wouldn't need them, right? You just hold it. And then maybe for the joystick, you might have to use your thumb to move your avatar, like left or right or whatever. And that's probably it. How would you program this controller to fit that action? What would you probably have? What would you do? Just looking at that controller, thinking about your audience, and thinking about embodying that experience. What buttons do you think you want to use?
So are we just remapping it to do the one particular action of hitting the ball?
We are, and we're going to assume, though, that for tennis, that's pretty much the only action you would need.
Right. Okay.
Moving and hitting a ball.
I would maybe use the trigger, just because basically people, depending on the game, like again, gamers, you know, the trigger fires the weapon. So maybe for the game, it fires the ball. Basically, you hit the ball, you're launching the ball. So kind of similar in that aspect.
How many of you were thinking about using a trigger to hit the ball?
So
I'm just curious.
My brain went to the joystick.
To hit the ball?
Mm-hmm.
What would be the idea behind that?
Anyway.
Just like the moving of the thumb. I don't know. Like my brain went. Like,
well, remember, there's no right answer here. So just so everybody's clear, yeah.
I thought that if you moved like the joystick to the right, the bracket would go to the right, and then if you moved it forward, it would go forward.
So already we have two very different mechanics. One is trigger, fire the ball. Makes sense to me. Very simple. One is, well, actually, I want to put some English on the ball. I want to be able to, like, spin it. And if I have an analog option, I could use the yellow joystick, and I could sort of make the racket go left or make the racket go right. What other options do we have?
You can do my second option would be the B button.
Yeah, the big green, the B button. So
Yeah,
the red one.
Mhm.
Interesting.
And stuff.
I would have chosen none of these. My eyes went immediately to A because it's big. And my big fat thumb's going to sit right there. But I didn't grow up playing GameCube. So what are some reasons why we're not choosing the A button?
Because what I interpret as A means jump.
Okay.
You know, and in a lot of games I play, A is jump a lot of the times. And
B is action. A is like move your character. B is do something with your character.
Right. B is more something I would push for action.
What are other folks thinking?
I never played with an A button, so I never even realized it existed.
Well, maybe the GameCube controller doesn't use it that often. I don't know. So I never owned one. So
I started off on PS3 because of my brother. So I've always been a PlayStation player. So I've never had a big A button.
How is everybody going to move the character around?
The joystick mostly.
The other joystick.
Point and click with the Wii controller. That's one method that a bunch of people use.
So on this one, you're gonna laugh at me. I'm so ingrained in digital controls that I rarely use the joysticks to move. I'm so wired for directional that whenever possible, I use a directional pad. Even though I know it's less efficient, I know it's not as smooth. I know it most games doesn't work with 3D games. It's nearly impossible. Like my big thing with playing Super Mario 64 on my Nintendo DS was that I had a really hard time just adjusting to how it was being displayed because the controls were different. But even here we see like there's lots of different ways to consider this choice. And those choices don't just matter because of the player per se, is that they literally would do different things. The ball would be hit different ways based on which one we decide to use here, right? Mm-hmm. There's lots of more abstract decisions that have to be made. This one I've also shown you, and I guess the answer is already on screen. This is actually the study that we did. We had folks playing Call of Duty, and of course up top you had the left trigger to zoom, the right trigger to fire, the joystick aimed your weapon, the other joystick moved your player. That seems like a pretty standard way of playing first-person shooters on a joypad or on a game controller. I'll tell you, as a PC gamer, this drove me and still drives me crazy. Like, I just cannot get this one down. I'm keyboard and mouse person. Like that's how I've been like trained. You know, WSAD and then mouse to look around. And of course, on the Wii, how do you shoot a gun? You just aim it. Like a TV remote, I think Alex said earlier. And you just point it, and then there's a trigger on the bottom. Now, when we had folks do this, though, they did not do very well. I'm going to skip down to that slide, and I'm going to pop back up. So we had people play a first-person shooter, 2 different versions of Call of Duty. And we were looking at the effect of these different cognitive skills on their performance. And then we were looking to see how that performance eventually affected how much they liked the game. And one of the things that we found is that while the same skills predicted performance based on which controller, with both controllers, the effects weren't as strong for one set over the other. In other words, we actually think that the players in the study who had these cognitive abilities, these abilities were more mapped to the GameCube controller than they were to the Wiimote. And so when they played the game and they had the GameCube controller, the better they did, the more they enjoyed the game. It's pretty obvious. But with the Wiimote, this relationship didn't exist. They only enjoyed the game if it wasn't frustrating. And that might seem like a bit of a duh, but what we're kind of getting at is frustration wasn't even a factor for the GameCube controller. It wasn't even a concern people had. Because it was, in their mind, this controller was so well mapped for the experience that these links didn't really appear. or they didn't matter. They actually appeared, but they didn't matter. Whereas with the Wii controller, this link didn't matter. And this one was the one they focused on. Even though that Wii controller was supposed to be the more natural one. It's tangible. You point it. What was the problem?
They weren't using the Link's crossbow training add-on.
Yeah, right. Well, but actually, talk about that a little bit, though.
Well, I know with some of the earlier Oculus dev kits, there are people who used Wiimotes, and obviously it's like specifically for some shooting games. I forget which ones exactly, but that.
Why would that have maybe made things better? Walk us through the logic.
Well, instead of aiming with one controller, I don't know if you've ever held a firearm, but you never aim with only one hand. I know in the movies they show, sometimes people even shooting handguns with one hand,
or sideways.
Yeah. But that's not how you do it. However, by doing that, it's more centered, and you might be able to see the end of the gun a little better, or the end of your remote, and be able to translate it to the screen a little better.
Mm-hmm. In the language of today, how would you describe the sort of how this controller, the Wii's crossbow attachment, pairs up with the action of shooting and like the sensory organs responsible for making that happen?
Honestly, I would say it fits within our definition of immersion. It's you're holding it and you visually see, something that's in a vague shape of a firearm or whatever you're using at the screen, and you see it and you feel it in your hands.
Right. And again, keeping in mind that these aren't like yes or no's, but they're matters of degree. So what you might argue is that it's a bit more immersive because it requires, more of your senses at a higher level, because you're holding it like this. You're centering the object on your target. You're looking down at sight line, right? It's more stable. The trigger is actually in a location where you would expect a trigger to be, right? And I suspect you'd probably do better as a result also.
Not to mention, that add-on's actually fairly comfortable.
Yeah, it's actually a fairly well-designed ergonomic add-on. And if you look at the back here where the direction goes, it's not that big of a stretch to just have your thumb to move around a little bit, to move your eyes, right? It's not perfect. It's not 100% natural, but it does seem a heck of a lot closer to, it's more immersive. It's definitely more, tangible. It's more tangible. Matters of degree. This may have worked really well. We didn't do this in the study, right? We did this. And this didn't work very well. Actually, people weren't good at aiming using this one, because they were just kind of floating their arm around a little bit, right? Not to mention, how do most of us play first-person shooters?
With a normal game
with
pad.
that controller up there, right? Or like when Alex was talking about a keyboard. In fact, if we had a keyboard function for a third condition, that may have been even more natural because of the WSAD and the mouse, even though it's the most abstract. And so the reason that this study was particularly interesting, and I think why it got published, is it started sort of talking about, which I think is what Alex was critiquing earlier about the rhythm games, is that it's not that this is totally wrong, but it's not that simple. And that naturalness might be more of a psychological perception than it is an objective property of a device. That immersion can be an objective property in terms of the number of things being immersed, right? But natural is not a good word for us to use with this type of research, with this type of experience. It kind of works backwards on us a little bit, right?
Yeah, so like this was actually really cool because that was actually like one of my questions.
Yeah,
regarding
hit us.
this particular research was like, you know, like they had more trouble with the Wii remote, but like my question was, would that be improved with like, you know, that gun accessory you were showing? Because I know those exist, and like if it's a first-person shooting game, they were actually, you know, holding a gun, you know, like and put the controller in there, you know, into that gun accessory built thing, that they would perform better, get more, you know, enjoyment and stuff, because factors go into it, and especially when we're firearm. Like the reason the gun is big is so that if a handgun is more easier to like miss your target because you have more motion. But like with a bigger gun, you know, if it's like bigger, like your motion is maybe more in line. You know, it's what I'm trying to explain. Is basically. Like,
no, I get it. That's why everything on screen exists.
Mm-hmm.
There's not just one gun attachment for Wii controllers. There are lots of different gun attachments for Wii controllers. Here's one from Cabela's for hunting. Here's a scope.
The shotgun one makes me laugh.
Yeah, here's a Cabela's Wii shotgun.
VR controllers too, just because that stability helps with aiming.
But then again, to go back to what Alex was saying, do we really want a scenario where like arcade machines where we need a different controller for every single experience? Like that gets expensive. It gets to be a lot to handle. There's a lot of other problems there. Like, you know, there's a proverb, not a proverb, there's sort of a fable told about an emperor of a kingdom. And this person wants a complete, like the best map of the kingdom they can have. And they hire map makers from around the world. And they say, come on in. I need you to make a map of my kingdom. And every time somebody makes a map of the kingdom, he doesn't like the map. It's not detailed enough. Okay? I spelled this wrong. Every time someone makes the map, you know, they give it to him and like, okay, that's a crappy map of my kingdom. Get out of here. You're fired. And then someone goes, okay, fine. Here's a better one, but that's still crappy. That's not what my kingdom looks like. There are trees here and you didn't capture those, and I don't see the villages. I don't see the people. You're fired. Where am I going with this story? So eventually, someone makes a map that is perfect, and they bring the map to the emperor, and they're like, this map details every tree, every rock, every bird, every fish, every brick in your kingdom. And when he presents the map to the king, what happens? Can you guess?
It's outdated.
No, everyone dies, actually. Because the map is the actual size of the kingdom, and it crushes the kingdom. It's worthless. Like, that's not what a map does, right? At that point, I don't need a map. I can just, like, go outside. Phil and Lindsay have a similar story with the coding they're working on, where if we coded every single thing that 700 Redditors said, at what point do we just say, here's the database? So their job is to abstract the coding in a way where people can go, oh, here are the patterns. Maps show patterns. Maps aren't perfect. They're not supposed to be perfect, right? So we do have a weird scenario where at what point do we make so many devices and controllers to where, like, you know, I don't know if this is going to be a good marketing strategy, that I have to have like a wall of controllers in my house to play every game.
No, you don't want that. You know,
No.
I feel like the goal for every developer is to make.
Sure. Go ahead, Jared.
Sorry, I know with the carbon tubes they have, or the tubes they have for the VR shooters, you just pop your controllers in and they're adjustable at different distances from each other, and they're attached. I think it's Carbon Pro or something. I don't know. Yeah, they look like those.
Yep.
And the one right next to that one, below that one, you know, they bend so you can kind of adjust them however you want. They fit a lot more than, you know, just a plastic thing like with. So you won't for that you won't necessarily need an entire wall.
But then going back to that, so this is
necessarily need need that. It's just kind of
No. These are all great discussions. And remember, one of the things I want you to take away from this class more than anything, I don't think we have right or wrong answers in this stuff. I don't think we have better answers. I don't think we have definitive claims. It's more about understanding the decision space and understanding the psychology of the players so that you can just better understand it, period. Right? These are great examples. But it kind of goes back to like what Alex was saying about the guitar. He's like, I play rhythm games all the time. I don't need a guitar to feel there. Do these devices help? Absolutely. I would love to see the research on whether or not they enhance or reduce presence. My guess, the data continually says they enhance presence, right? Partly because, and I think, Jared, what you know of from these experiences is that you don't see that device when you're using it, right? What do you see?
You see what's in front of you virtually.
Right. So this device can look totally abstract and weird. This is something where VR might have an edge on gaming. Because if you were using this to play Call of Duty on PS4, what might be a potential barrier to spatial presence?
Oh, depth perception.
I mean, just seeing this wand in your hand that's like
That too.
not a gun, right? Like I'm holding a broken broomstick in my hand and going pew pew, right? Depth perception can matter as well. But in VR, your senses are taken away from the space around you. And they're put somewhere else, aren't they? So the considerations of... the VR developers can make this, and they don't have to worry about it looking real. Right? Whereas like the Wii gun, that's not super real looking, but it definitely has an aesthetic to it.
Mm-hmm.
To somewhat make it work. Oh, that's a joke, obviously, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
You know. And all of this gets back into that general notion of whether or not, like, what do we mean when we say natural? And this all goes back into that cyborgic conversation that we're really good at taking tools. And as long as the tools function for the thing we want them to function for, we're good with them. They as long as they don't even necessarily have to immerse our senses for us to think they're natural. Right. Which gets into this weird dilemma, right? We talked about presence already. You know, some other notes on the Wii we've kind of already covered in the past that, you know, when we did our study, and this is, you know, going to be like in the mid 2010s, so it's a little outdated, but the what we saw with Wii games, and again, the focus on the Wii here was more that was a really good example of commercially viable and commercially available natural mapping, right? I don't know if I can think of competitors on the market right now. Can you think of any? I mean, I guess PlayStation had the Move system.
Like a motion controller that is not VR?
Yeah, because I think they're still kind of in different atmospheres or different categories. What do you think?
Can't think of much. Yeah, all that comes in mind, like around that time, was the Kinect.
Yeah, okay, the Kinect, sure. And of course, the Kinect would have been a non-tangible, right?
I mean, right. The Kinect is also used for rudimentary full body tracking in VR nowadays.
Yeah, it still is. Yeah. It does fairly well, best we can tell. Like, it works, you know.
It's a pretty interesting piece of technology, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, the Kinect is... it was a bit ahead of its time, I think, in terms of tracking cameras, and it looks like tech spec wise still does very well. It's interesting to see. It kind of goes back to that '80s video one. So the Wii made sense to study because it was sort of like the commercially viable. It was definitely sold as being a motion system. I don't think Nintendo ever used natural language. I could be wrong there, but they certainly used motion language. It was all about kinesic natural mapping. Right? It was all about moving your body and things move along with you. What we noticed is that while there are good Wii games, and like the good games have crazy high ratings, there are a lot of bad Wii games. And it seemed like at proportions that are much higher than you would expect for other gaming systems.
So, can I just put a thing on that?
Sure.
What you're saying? The Nintendo Wii is one of the best-selling consoles of all time.
Yeah.
It was in fact so popular that there are games that were made for it this year.
Yep.
That's how popular of a console it was. And so, as a result, a lot of games that are referred to as shovelware were placed onto the Wii by a bunch of different companies.
That's exactly where I'm going with this conversation.
Yeah.
So walk us through that in terms of natural mapping and controller designs. Because that's actually the problem. I think that you identified precisely what we were studying. The short answer, Call of Duty had no fucking business being on the Wii. It was never designed for the Wii. It was never taking the Wii into account. Explain to everybody what you mean by shovelware.
Shovelware is a game that is poorly made. It's just a cash-in.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that you make either so that you can, as a company, make a tax write-off, or you could just be like, okay, yeah, we made a game for the Wii. We're on the Wii. Look at our work on the Wii.
That is part of it.
We're a game company.
There are also game companies where you just shovel something off to every console that's on the market.
Yes.
Right? The Wii is one of the best-selling consoles of all time. It still has games coming out. Again, as I said, the games that are good were amazing. Like they have ratings that they even tried to make Wii games on other platforms to emulate them because it was so good. And of course, it hasn't always worked out as well because there was something about it being on the Wii. There was one that involved a Spirit Fox. It was an art game. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Kami?
Okami. Where you actually like painted along with the game and you had motions that were very natural in the experience, and it's pretty revered as a game. This one here, yeah, Okami. Right? Why do you think some of these games were doing so bad? Besides the fact that they're just bad games, because I mean, I'll be honest, all systems have bad games, but there was something unique about why the ones on the Wii were doing so bad. And it has to do with our conversation today. Go ahead.
Were they just not necessarily built for them? Because like the current consoles at the time, like the Xbox 360, PS3, had very similar controllers in regards to how you held it, what sticks did what buttons did what, and the Wii was completely different.
A lot of people just either some of what Alex is getting at, just did very poor jobs of taking advantage of the controller system. That just because it's natural doesn't mean it's easy. And just like we had earlier, we had a conversation about you still have to decide what button's going to do what. And those are consequential decisions. The other one was that they weren't, if you're porting, what you just said, Avi, if you're porting a game from a Golden Hands console to a motion console, that may not work. So when I say Call of Duty had no business on the Wii, Call of Duty as programmed had no business on the Wii. It wasn't developed on that platform. They just remap things quickly. Alex said this about a half hour ago about like Guitar Hero. Can you explain again about like how the Guitar Hero controller, yes, is tangibly naturally mapped, but it's still abstract?
So on the Guitar Hero controller, you have the buttons, and then you have the strum. And so when you think about it, the strum is really just, no matter if you strum up or down, it's still just strum. Mm-hmm. So in that case, it's really just the press of the A button, if you think about it like that. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, you would think, okay, so then these colors that I'm pressing are also just colors on other keys or buttons on my controller. So for example, the green button is the A button on my Xbox 360 controller. Mm-hmm. Think of it like that.
Mm-hmm. And so while it is designed to be more realistic and more tangible, it's still abstract. They still had to make decisions. Now, it's very clever that they put them on a guitar neck and on a strum, and that's really neat, right? But they're still abstract. There's still some mapping involved. There's still a disconnect between the controller and the experience, and those decisions can be consequential, right? In the case of like this here and those bad ratings, I think what we saw going on is that it just wasn't selling it. Like they just weren't really syncing very well. And that was what started our study. We were like, how is it that so many of these games are just not doing well? One person here in the middle, the simple answer is that the best of the best developers just don't make games for Wii because they make games with traditional controllers. And so all they would do is take their game and then just give it to Nintendo and go, okay, here you go. Here's the Wii version, right? We thought what was going on here is there was just the disconnect between this language of natural and moving and the experience of the gamers themselves, who were like, these games are awful, right? Again, even cutting out the ones that are just like trash games, period. The ones where you go to Walmart today, they're like the 99-cent bin, right? That kind of stuff. What we found is that on the one hand, is it new? Well, you've got, higher enjoyment and presence. Maybe you feel perceptually more self-efficacy, better at playing because you can move your hands. We saw some early evidence that people did seem to prefer motion controllers over non-motion controllers. A lot of discussions around interactivity, which, thinking about day one, if interactivity is your control over, how much control you have over the form and content on screen, well, if I can do these things, I can influence a lot more of the screen than if I have to do these more specific button presses, right? And so that's going to play a role here. So there are some reasons to believe that these Wii controllers should be doing really well. But then on the other side, we saw that it wasn't preferred as much. The users didn't like it as much. Expert users, gamers. We saw that the cognitive skills that translated over to performance weren't working for these motion controllers. Some people perceived them as just straight up lower. And the performance was suffering as well, right? In these studies, I don't know why this old watermark keeps popping up here. We thought that one thing could be going on is that maybe it's the case that they're fun because they're novel. And the novelty hypothesis would be, you hop on and you really enjoy it for a while. But as you play it for a while, you realize it's kind of lame and then you stop playing it. Maybe that's what was accounting for these low scores, In fact, Alex, you're probably right. The reason that shovelware is so initially successful is because it's usually cheaper, right? Those are the games that are like $10 or $12 or $8. And if you've got a brand new system without a lot of games on it, you just go to Walmart and buy the stuff off the shelf. And it's just something to move your hands around with. And it was probably fun in the beginning and it wore off pretty quickly, right? Then there's the learning hypothesis, which is kind of the opposite. That, in some ways, we don't have to learn as much. We can start off with good skills. And as we play for a while, our self-efficacy goes up, our ability to play goes up, and then we enjoy it even more. And so we were trying to figure out why these scores were just so low. And this is a bit of a clunky model. I'm not going to ask you to know these statistics or anything of that nature, but it will help you to know that what we essentially found is that the more experience you have with whatever controller you were talking about, the more natural you thought it was. The better you felt it using it, and the more you enjoyed the experience. That's not all that surprising. If we use things, we're good at them. If we're good at them, we enjoy using them. What's interesting is, again, this idea of naturalness. And that we're finding that these, natural user interfaces aren't being perceived as natural. People had far more experience with the game pads than they did with the Wii modes. Controller type, this refers to it being a handheld versus a motion controller. Okay. This was coded in such a way that higher scores meant Wiimote. Negative relationship. So the Wiimote users had less experience. The Wiimote users had less efficacy. They didn't feel as confident with these things. Again, what we're pointing out is just because you smack a label on it that says natural doesn't mean people are going to take it up that way. And the novelty wears off really fast. There was an effect that if you thought that natural controllers were cool, you did see them as more natural. But the real driving force in this research was that they're just not being done very well. And then when you ask the players, they preferred the handheld experience. And it's probably a combination of some really crappy experiences, the shovelware that Alex is talking about, and having games that weren't designed for those interfaces. Call of Duty wasn't really designed to be played with a remote like that. And it had a pretty bad effect on players as a whole. I actually have to pull up what the rating was for that game. Can anybody think of games they played on a natural interface that just didn't work very well?
What do you mean by natural interface?
Like Nintendo Wii or Microsoft Kinect, or the natural in the sense of what we're talking about here, the motion sensor, motion control, things like that.
I remember when I was young, I got a Kinect, and I played this one game called Kinectimals, and that was awful. It was awful.
Do you remember anything about what particularly just did not make this thing work?
Well, so the thing that it felt like was it was basically Microsoft's answer to Nintendogs, because the Kinect came out around the same time that Nintendogs was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, oh, let's also get these cute animals, and since you have a Kinect, you can pet them by doing this at the screen. And when I tried it, I was like, this is awful. That's... And like as a kid, even then, I was like, "This is not fun. Like, I don't like this."
And what was the Kinect motion? Can you explain that again to us? Like, what was the incorporation of like? Oh wow!
Like act like you're petting the animal.
So you're just like, this is not.
Who pets an animal like that?
Right.
Whoever designed the Kinect thing, because that's what it told me to do. I don't know what else to say.
And that's what we often think about, right? We're like,
have a pet.
How does this motion coordinate with that event, right? And it sounds like it didn't. The mapping wasn't there, right? We're thinking about this idea of, immersion, and the immersion was not there. You're like, I am not feeling any, I'm not using my sense of touch in a way that is going to work for this thing. If we go all the way back up to this Bioka slide here, there's a clear disconnect between sensory engagement and motor engagement. And in this case, relatively low sensory engagement because it wasn't presenting anything in any perceptual way other than like probably interesting graphics, right? And then motor engagement, that's like, I got nothing here. So my Kinectimal is not working. But yet Nintendogs for the DS did really well. How did you interface with your dog in Nintendogs?
Touch the screen.
Yeah, with the stylus. Why did that work okay? Even though that's weird too, but that seemed to work just fine. Any reason why like using the stylus to like scratch the screen and then your dog like plays with the wand, why would that have worked?
It's simple.
It's simple.
A concise movement.
Yeah, and you know what? Mentally it connects. Like, oh, scratch the screen and then my dog will scratch back. Oh, tap the screen and my dog will go over here. There's a guy named Jay Posey who talks about, he has a talk from Game Developers Conference called Taste Like Chicken, and it's authenticity in a totally fake world. And he talks a lot about in video games how oftentimes you're not trying to recreate the one-to-one experience. We don't need the map of the kingdom. We just need enough flavors of the experience to get into it. And sometimes these control systems can do a really good job at adding that flavor. But sometimes they're used, I think, as parlor tricks to add to the flavor. Like in the case of Kinectimals. And you're like, this is dumb. Right? This is not working. It's an example of that stylus version. And you may have felt more spatially present in that stylus version of Nintendogs than you did in front of your TV trying to pet the cat that is way over there and not responding to you, right? Which is kind of what you were talking about with those controllers earlier. Does anybody else have other examples or experiences, or like a vice versa of systems that should not have worked? Like if we're thinking about abstraction, and yet seem to do really well for your experience. Like you enjoyed it, you felt immersed. Go ahead, Javier.
Well, I can think of a particular somebody else's experience. Are you aware of the gaming YouTuber Angry Joe?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Are you, do you know a YouTube personality named Angry Joe?
I don't.
Well, he has a famous review about a Kinect game, Sonic Free Riders, and he hates that game with passion. It was his first 1 out of 10 review. They give the game a 1, and he talks about how the motions just don't match. It's like it's basically like a hoverboard game, racing hoverboard game. And you like tilt the controller. He talked about how tilting is so imprecise, oversensitive. You always keep crashing. It doesn't sense your feet when you're trying to make the board go faster because you have to push it like a skateboard and stuff. It was pretty entertaining and fun, but that's like an example of a game very poorly made for the Kinect. So.
It almost seems like when we start getting into this sensory motor coordination, we change our comparison point. And then it's no longer just about the video game, it's about the action. Right? Yeah. And like, if you're going to have me on a hoverboard, if you're going to have me pet a dog, if you're going to have me shoot a gun, like, you better do it. Because anything that breaks from that model I have is just not going to work. And the irony, the dilemma here is all of these naturally mapped experiences are almost by definition more natural than this one. Mm-hmm. And yet we respond to them negatively.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a big thing for today and trying to figure out what's going on the player's side that's causing these things to break down. Enough to where it happens a lot. It happens a whole lot. We've got the diaper treadmill that doesn't make me feel like I'm walking. We've got the Wiimote that doesn't make me feel like I'm shooting. We have the dog that I can't pet, right? Not that we don't have mapping issues with standard traditional gamepad controllers, but the issues seem to be a little different, right? They don't often engage this model as concretely, right? All right, cool. We got about 14 minutes left, and then we're gonna be good here. So I showed you this model. Then we followed up to figure out like enjoyment itself. And one of the things that was kind of interesting there is for the gamepad, that perceived naturalness was a really important predictor of enjoyment. Like, it really was important that players felt that the controls were intuitive. Thinking about it from a demand model, it's really important that players see low demand in those controls, right? If those controls are too demanding, we start to reject the experience. And why is that from a demand model? Because what are the other demands we have to deal with? This would be from the verse week.
Emotional demand, physical demand. Yeah, there's like 4 different demands.
Yeah, we got some folks on the chat that have been pretty quiet. So even if your camera's off, you can still type in the chat window. I want to make sure I get at least every person's voice in here once. But you said emotional?
Yeah, and then there's the physical.
And then like the 2 different physicals, yeah. So emotional, help them out. What's the obvious one from a gaming perspective? Solving puzzles and figuring out the system. And
Cognitive.
Cognitive. And there's one more. Help them out. So we already got physical, the 2 different types. You've already got emotional. We've already got cognitive. There's one more.
Social.
The social bits. And not only socializing with other humans, but also other non-humans. And of course, the point we're making here is games demand a lot of us. We've just spent a bunch of time on one of them. And if this one's starting to break, or starting to require more attention than we need, or starting to become frustrating, or allocate too many resources, we don't have the additional resources to cope with the other things. We're focusing so much on why I can't pet this dog that we're missing like the narrative of the lost dog, right? Mm-hmm. Or we're ignoring the NPCs, or we're doing other things, and we're not getting the experience. And so in all of this, it also has to be designed in a way that facilitates the action. So I think what Alex was saying earlier about rhythm games, and I play a lot of rhythm games myself, especially when in Taiwan they're insanely popular. And when I'm playing these rhythm games, I'm focusing on the physical demands and the cognitive demands. But, you know, I don't necessarily need a guitar in my hand to do that. And I can also just like focus on the, quick solving the puzzle, right? So we found that the game pads were more natural, and that was impacting enjoyment. And then for the natural interfaces, the Wiimote, the only thing that mattered was the controller experience. If you had used them before, then you enjoyed it. Down below, efficacy was important for both of them. So in both conditions, if you're good, if you think you're good, you're going to enjoy it. These are very different paths to enjoyment, though. Because if you have to have experience in order to enjoy the motion game, isn't that a bit of a paradox? Because the motion game is supposed to be natural. It's not supposed to require experience. And that was kind of the irony in here. Like, the one that's designed for you not to have to learn it, you actually have to learn it to get experience with it, to be good at it. Whereas with the gamepad, it was more a function of just, it seems natural. It seems right. These controls map to that action. And in fact, controller experience didn't matter at all. And that's what was real weird about the study. And why we think some of those Wii experiences were just kind of tanking a little bit. Okay. Is that making sense so far?
Yeah.
Cool. We're going to move on to, we only got a couple more. When we asked people to kind of talk about it a little more, what they would say over and over again was that, and what these tables are, this is the frequency of how often that theme was mentioned by those people. Okay. I'm just highlighting a few of the more interesting findings. So the gamepad was much more likely to be talked about as being more precise, being more natural, being more comfortable. And I bet you that precision one really mattered. Like, this is better at achieving the goals. Like, the joysticks are smooth and accurate. And then likewise, like the NUI, the Wiimote, was very unnatural. But look what they said. It wasn't as accurate as I expected or wanted. It speaks to almost like an unfair comparison. Because the people using the gamepad were probably just comparing it to what?
A game that they had already played before.
Yeah, any other game using a gamepad. Which, as long as it was like, okay, whatever, fine. What do you think the people in this condition were comparing it to?
Real life, like actual, if it's like, like playing tennis, like, comparing it to when you actually play tennis, the actual natural movement of the activity you're doing.
And if we think about this in terms of the war game, this gets even more complicated. So what do you think they were comparing it to for Call of Duty? I'm going to assume most of them have never fired a World War II era weapon.
No. Maybe some of them have never even fired a firearm.
Right, and probably most of them, I suspect. So what do you think they were comparing it to? I want to get Sam and Afriki on here at least once in the next 7.5 minutes. But what do you think they were comparing it to? So Avery said movies, and that's interesting. Avery, unpack that a little bit, because you might be onto something. So maybe they're comparing it to, like, other experiences they've seen? Or maybe it's more of like an imagined, sort of like, I think I know how guns work. And they seem pretty accurate in movies and in war films and in, like, I assume guns, like, shoot people and work quite well. And I mean, the mechanics of a gun to a non-owner don't seem that complicated. We don't debate them because they're complicated, right? Watching others shoot weapons, I can do the same thing. We talk about it in terms of social learning theory, right? Has anybody heard social learning theory before? Like the idea that I can learn through observation to do things just by watching somebody else do them. And all of that. So what maybe happens is they're comparing it to shooting. And even if they don't know how shooting works, they're pretty sure it doesn't work like this. Which is going to be a challenge a dilemma for the further development of these types of control systems. You almost get an unfair comparison point. You got to take reality or my imagination of what could be perceptually real to think about Lombard and Ditton last time. Versus in the controller conditions, it's just as long as it matches other controllers, I'm good. I don't complain about like this QWERTY keyboard versus another QWERTY keyboard. But you give me a Dvorak and I'm mad that it's on a pin. Right? And that's why this data, I think, was getting published and cited. It's not that it's overly dramatic by itself, but it has some implications for design and for research here and for better understanding the player side. And again, Javier, when you were saying it depends on a player, it's not that you were wrong. It's that we can identify those variables that it actually depends on. Self-efficacy, prior experience, attitudes towards the controller to begin with. We can systemize those, we can measure those, and we can make predictions. So as researchers, we can understand this stuff. As developers, we can actually use that data to make better systems into the future.
And the frequency of those variables could change depending from person to person. Some may have more than others, right?
Well, so it can't here because these are overall frequencies of all the people in the study. So these essentially present to you what we would interpret as the averages, you know. So
right. Yeah, the average between each.
Yeah, so if these are all the people who use the gamepad compared to all the people who use the Wiimote, that's how often this theme came up versus that theme. Right. So we can never explain one person. That is very true, but we can explain the patterns.
Right.
Right. We can make predictions based on those patterns. To the extent we know these people very well. One limitation in this study, almost everybody was a gamepad user to begin with. You know, so I think a couple of you asked, how would this change today now that we're seeing more natural interfaces from the onset? Natural being the perceptual system interfaces. And my answer is we'll probably see these patterns change over time. But then again, QWERTY's been around for 100 plus years and we're still using it, so you know. You'll be curious to find out. Maybe our mental model for Mario Tennis isn't the same as our mental model for tennis. They might share common attributes, but we don't expect the same things. This is the reason why Sam wanted to have a way to put English on the tennis ball, and Javier is like, nah, man, it's like a gun. You just shoot that ball, right? Those are both examples of like Mario Tennis. Real tennis, we may not have the same model for that. You know, when Alex is talking about walking around in this Omnitrax, it may not be that important for Mario Tennis. Does it make the experience better? Not really. Now, if I'm out on a tennis field, a tennis court, I probably want to move around more. Right?
That probably stems from I was a tennis player back in high school, so.
No, but Sam, that's a great answer, though, right? You played tennis, so you know how remarkably important it is to, like, go, versus, You know what Javi and I don't know? We're out there like cave people just smashing the ball back at each other. And you go walking by and laugh at us, but we don't care because we're having fun.
That's fair.
We're like, yay, tennis! And you're like, that's not... You guys are not playing tennis.
It's anarchy.
That's anarchy. I'm leaving. But what you said's a great example. Javier, I'm guessing you don't play tennis.
Nope, not really.
No, he's like, no, I don't care. The ball needs to leave my racket. I don't care how it does that. Sam's like, no, man, I need to place it here and here and here. A drop hit, a deep hit, a looper, like all these different things. And we're like, no. And he's like, right, he's like, a looper's not a thing. A wicked googly, you don't hit those? No.
You were good up until you said that.
Looper, yeah. There are no loopers and wicked googlies in tennis.
I mean, I have seen it go through the little triangle. I guess
sure.
That's a looper. I don't know.
Sam mentioned like ping pong without letting the ball touch the table. You know, like, yeah, we could see how these models could change. And the one about experience is important because people will say like the people who want to play tennis don't particularly care for the Wiimote version. But of course they don't care for the Wiimote version. Same reason the pilots didn't want the Xbox controller, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe our mental model for a shooting range just isn't the same for our mental model of like being a space marine. right?
Mhm.
I think Alex hit on something earlier about you've also got to consider the other parts of the game that could make you feel present in the experience. Those other demands, right? These things don't necessarily match up in the ways that we assume they match up. It doesn't mean they can't. So the VR folks in the call might be like, "Oh, it definitely can match up." There's just a matter of figuring out what is it we're actually trying to match. What models are matching what experiences? Which ones need sensory immersion? Which ones don't need sensory immersion? There's probably room for all of these experiences. Like Jared and Avery, to be honest, what I'm looking forward to is going to the virtual arcade where I can play ping pong on a flat screen, but do it on my Oculus, but walk up to a cabinet and actually have my hands on the cabinet, which I think is a thing in Ready Player One, if I'm not mistaken. Like, he goes to an arcade and plays Joust. Like, that to me would be like the coolest thing ever. And that seems silly, but I love it nonetheless. All right, we're right at time. And of course, the models may not fit, except when they do fit. So like when they had the driving game versus the Wiimote, the driving game did a great job at predicting naturalness, feeling more spatially present, having more enjoyment. Whereas the Wii version didn't do a good job here. But of course, in this case, the target activity was probably so well aligned with my expectations and my models of the driving activity that we were good to go. Right? So what are the takeaways here? As we more deeply engage with digital spaces, we seem to have a desire to feel them, just like we do meat space, our physical worlds. But as we do this, there still seems to be a preference, sometimes, for opaque rather than transparent technologies, where we actually often seem to think the opaque one is more natural to us. And as we become more cyborgic, this preference is probably going to shift, but it's something we'll have to think about, you know, because what is the nature of natural? And that's kind of how the three different points all fit in today. All right. Any final questions? That's all I've got for you. I really appreciate you hanging in as usual. Don't forget this week, you're going to be in those chat forums. Make sure to send me a note so I know you're registered. I got a couple during the class today, but make sure I get those. 3 posts minimum, okay?
Where do we go to get...
You should have gotten an email from our colleagues at NCCU. If you have it, just email me on the side, and I'll send you the instructions. But they sent over an instruction guide.
NCCU? Is that what it is?
They sent our colleagues at the other university sent over a guideline for how to register for their accounts. So you should have an email in your inbox with that information.
Okay, I will go and look for that.
Yeah, you might check your junk folder because it would have been like nccu.tw and your email may have filtered it out. But if you can't find it today, just let me know. Okay?
Okay.
All right, folks.
I'll email you if I cannot find it.
All right, drop me a note if you need anything else. I think that's all we got. Thank you for the day. All right?
Thank you.
Well, you'll have a good day.
Oh no, this is gonna be
Have a good one,
fun
Dr.
for me.
Cool.